Hey everyone, and welcome to Framing Minds. I'm Arthur Ivers, and I guess you could say I'm your guide to the world of political philosophy.
I'm Ava Ingram. I'm here to help make sure we all actually understand it.
That's right, because today we are diving headfirst into some deep ideas.
Yeah, think of it like cliff diving, you know?
But instead of water, we're landing in political philosophy.
We'll have metaphorical floaties, of course.
Exactly. We're going to break down these big, sometimes kind of intimidating ideas, into bite-sized pieces that you can actually digest.
And maybe even enjoy.
For our first deep dive, we are tackling a book that's been causing a stir for centuries.
Centuries, yeah.
The Prince by Niccolò Machiavelli.
It's like the OG political strategy guide, right?
From way back in the 1500s.
But still making waves today.
You might be thinking, a book from the 1500s, what could that possibly have to do with me?
Well, Machiavelli was dealing with some seriously timeless questions.
About power and leadership.
And the choices people make when the stakes are high.
Think of it like this. The Prince is kind of like a playbook for understanding how people gain and hold on to power.
It's full of juicy stories, real-world examples, and
Some pretty controversial advice.
Machiavelli wasn't afraid to push boundaries.
And get people thinking.
Yeah, about the not-so-pretty side of politics.
All right, let's unpack this.
Okay.
The Prince is basically a guide for rulers, right? It's like Machiavelli sat down with a young prince and said, look, if you want to stay in charge, here's how you do it.
Straight talk, no sugarcoating.
Exactly.
He's all about practicality.
Less concerned with what should be.
And more interested in what is.
Giving rulers a realistic view of how power works.
Even if it wasn't always pretty.
So he wasn't exactly Mr.
Not exactly.
Guy, huh?
Let's just say he wasn't afraid to tell it like it is.
And one of his most famous...
Most debated ideas.
This whole thing about being feared versus being loved.
Yeah.
Seems pretty intense.
Right.
Is he saying it's better to rule through terror?
Well, it's more nuanced than that. Machiavelli does say that it's better to be feared than loved.
Okay.
But ideally, a ruler would inspire both. Both.
How do you do that?
Well, he believed that love is fickle.
Okay.
It depends on the whims of the people.
Okay, so one day they might love you.
Right, one day they might love you.
And the next day.
The next day, who knows?
People can be unpredictable, I guess,
Yeah.
in politics and life.
Right.
But fear, on the other hand,
Fear.
is based on a ruler's ability to enforce consequences.
Right. To punish.
Which makes it a more reliable foundation for power.
Exactly.
Okay, I see that.
You're...
On a very basic level.
Yeah.
If people know there will be consequences for messing with you,
For sure.
they're probably going to think twice.
Yeah.
But it still sounds kind of dark.
Yeah.
Like, is Machiavelli saying there's no room for compassion or fairness in leadership?
He wasn't exactly a Hallmark Channel kind of guy.
Okay.
But he wasn't saying compassion or fairness or bad things.
Okay.
He was just looking at things
From a very practical perspective.
from a practical perspective.
So how does this play out in the real world?
Right.
Does he give any examples
He does.
of how this fear factor has actually worked in history?
Absolutely. Tons of historical examples.
Okay.
Especially from ancient Rome.
Okay.
And one of the most interesting
Okay.
is Hannibal,
Hannibal.
the famous Carthaginian general
I know Hannibal.
who led an army.
With elephants across the Alps.
Yes, with elephants.
Wait, elephants? Seriously?
Yes.
That's awesome.
Talk about making an entrance.
That's incredible.
But here's where it gets interesting.
Okay.
Even Hannibal,
Even Hannibal.
who's super successful,
Yeah.
was criticized for being too lenient with his troops.
So he's saying that even a military genius like Hannibal,
Even Hannibal?
with his war elephants,
Yes.
needed to maintain a bit of fear to stay in control.
Exactly.
Wow.
And he contrasted Hannibal with some Roman generals who were known for being more lenient. And he argues that their leniency could make them vulnerable.
So even if you're a great leader, you still need to maintain that edge.
Right.
It's like
Yeah.
you could be cool, but you can't be a pushover.
That's a pretty good way to put it.
Okay. I'm starting to see how this book got so controversial.
Machiavelli definitely wasn't afraid to shake things up.
He makes you question everything you thought you knew about power and leadership.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we've talked about fear.
Yeah.
But let's get back to that whole the ends justify the means thing.
Right.
How far is a leader supposed to go?
Yeah.
I mean, are we talking about like full-on supervillain territory?
Here's
or...
the big question, right?
Yeah.
And this is where Machiavelli really pushes the boundaries.
Okay.
He actually argues that it can be acceptable for a ruler to break promises. Yes, it serves their interests.
Hold up.
Yeah.
Isn't that like the opposite of what we're taught?
It is.
Keep your promises, be a good person.
Yeah, it definitely goes against conventional morality.
Oh.
But Machiavelli is all about results.
Okay.
To be fair to him.
Okay.
He's not saying that it's good to break promises.
Yep.
He's just acknowledging that sometimes in the real world,
yeah,
leaders make difficult choices.
So sometimes you have to bend the rules to get things done.
Maybe not bend, more like reimagine the rules.
Reimagine, okay.
He was looking at power from a very different perspective than most people.
Okay, so give me some examples.
Okay.
Who did Machiavelli see as a real-world example?
Yeah.
Of a ruler who wasn't afraid to get things done.
Yes.
Even if it meant breaking the rules.
One of the figures he talks about is Cesare Borgia.
Cesare Borgia.
The son of Pope Alexander VI.
Okay, I've heard that name.
He was ambitious and used tactics that most people would consider pretty ruthless.
Ruthless.
He wasn't afraid of a little deception or violence.
Oh, wow.
If it helped him gain power.
Cesare Borgia. That name rings a bell.
Yeah.
Wasn't he like a supervillain or something?
I think he definitely had that reputation.
He's actually said to have inspired the character of Don Corleone and The Godfather.
Wow. He must have really made an impression on Machiavelli.
He did. Machiavelli saw him as a prime example of a ruler who understood how to get things done, even if it meant playing dirty.
Playing dirty,
Another example he uses is Alvarado da Fermo, a nobleman in the early 1500s who took power in his hometown through some, well, let's just say less than admirable actions.
So basically Machiavelli is saying, hey, sometimes you gotta play dirty to win.
It's not quite that simple. He's saying a ruler needs to be adaptable. And sometimes that means making difficult choices. Even if those choices aren't exactly textbook good guy moves.
So Machiavelli is all about being strategic. And being realistic, even if it means going against what people normally consider, right?
That's a great way to put it.
Okay.
He was really challenging people to think differently about power and leadership.
Yeah. Okay. I'm starting to get it.
Good.
Now, Machiavelli also talks about different types of armies. Right?
Yeah, he does. He talks about mercenaries,
auxiliaries,
and national armies.
Okay, break it down for me.
Okay.
What's the difference between these types of armies?
Mercenaries are basically hired guns.
Okay.
You pay them, they fight for you.
Okay.
Auxiliaries are troops borrowed from an ally.
Okay.
And national armies are made up of a ruler's own citizens.
Got it. So who does Machiavelli think is the best option? I feel like just hiring an army when you need one would be pretty convenient.
Right.
Less hassle.
It might seem that way.
Yeah.
But Machiavelli actually saw mercenaries as a huge risk.
Really? Why is that?
Well, they're not fighting for their own country. Or their own people.
Right.
They're in it for the money.
So their loyalty is kind of flexible?
Flexible, yeah.
They might just switch sides if someone offers them a better deal.
Exactly. And even if they do fight well, you're still depending on outsiders to defend your power.
Yes.
Right. Which makes you vulnerable.
Vulnerable. Okay.
He actually uses the Carthaginians as an example here.
The Carthaginians.
Remember that.
Ones with the elephants.
Oh, listen, the elephant.
Oh, of course. I'm not going to forget the elephants anytime soon.
Well, they relied heavily on mercenary armies.
Yeah.
And guess what? Well, it almost destroyed them, even when those mercenaries were led by their own citizens.
Wow. So he's basically saying don't put your fate in the hands of people who aren't truly invested in your success?
That's a great summary.
Okay.
Machiavelli believed you want soldiers who are loyal to you and your state.
Right.
Not just to the highest bidder.
Makes total sense.
Right.
So mercenaries are risky.
Yes.
Auxiliaries are kind of iffy.
Iffy, yeah.
Because you're relying on someone else's troops.
Right, someone else's troops.
That means a national army, soldiers from your own country is really the best way to go.
If you want to hold on to power.
If you want to hold on to power.
According to Machiavelli, that's the ideal scenario. Okay, I can see his point.
Good.
So we've covered
a lot.
Fear.
Yeah.
Breaking promises. The different types of armies.
Yeah.
And being adaptable.
Adaptable.
Is there anything else that really stands out in Machiavelli's advice to rulers?
There's a lot more we could talk about, but one more important concept is Machiavelli's idea of fortuna. Fortuna.
That's Italian for fortune, right?
Yep.
Is he talking about luck?
Yep. He recognized that luck plays a big role in a ruler's success.
Absolutely. I mean, there are some things you just can't predict or control no matter how much you plan.
Right.
But he also believed that a wise ruler could prepare for and even try to manipulate Fortuna to their advantage.
Manipulate luck.
Manipulate luck. How is that even possible?
It's not about controlling every little thing.
Okay.
It's more about being prepared for the unexpected.
Being prepared. Okay.
Machiavelli uses this great metaphor about a raging river.
Oh, yeah.
You can't stop the river.
You can't stop the river, no.
But you can build dams and channels
Okay.
to control where it flows.
I remember that.
Yes.
So it's about being strategic?
Strategic.
And anticipating challenges.
Yes.
Instead of just letting fate sweep you away.
Exactly. You can't control everything.
Right.
But you can try to be smart and prepared.
I like that.
Yeah.
So even though Machiavelli had some pretty strong opinions about how power works, he also believed that good leaders could be proactive and strategic and influence their own luck by being smart and adaptable.
That's right. And I think that's one of the reasons why his work is still so relevant.
Yeah.
Even hundreds of years later.
Hundreds of years later.
It makes you think about the choices leaders make and how they try to shape the world around them.
It's definitely food for thought.
It is.
And even though Machiavelli's world was very different from ours,
Very different.
I bet we can still find some pretty striking parallels if we look closely enough.
We definitely can, and that's what we're going to do in the next part of this deep dive.
All right, so we've explored some of Machiavelli's key ideas: fear versus love, the end, justifying the means, and this whole concept of Fortuna. It's pretty heavy stuff.
It is. And it's important to remember that Machiavelli's work has sparked debate for centuries.
Centuries, yeah.
People have interpreted his ideas in so many different ways.
It seems like everyone has an opinion about Machiavelli. Was he a cynical genius, a ruthless pragmatist, or maybe just a really misunderstood dude trying to make sense of a crazy world?
Right. It's like a giant Rorschach test. People see in it what they want to see. Some people think he's advocating for a win-at-all-costs approach to leadership.
Right.
While others see him as a more nuanced thinker who is simply trying to present a realistic view of how power works.
I guess that's what makes political philosophy so interesting, right?
Exactly.
It makes you question your assumptions.
For sure.
And think critically about how we should organize ourselves as a society.
Absolutely. It's all about asking tough questions and grappling with complex ideas.
Now, one thing I find really interesting about The Prince is that it's not just some abstract theoretical treatise.
Right.
Machiavelli was writing from experience.
Yeah, he actually served as a diplomat and government official in Florence.
So he was out there.
He was out there.
In the trenches.
In the trenches.
Dealing with real-world political struggles.
And that experience probably shaped his views quite a bit.
Yeah, for sure. So he'd seen firsthand how messy and unpredictable politics could be.
Definitely.
One of the things that really brings The Prince to life is all the historical examples Machiavelli uses.
Right.
He's like a master storyteller.
Yeah.
Weaving these tales of intrigue and power struggles.
Yeah, and real-world examples.
From ancient Rome and his own time.
They make his points so much more vivid and memorable.
Speaking of stories, one of my favorite parts is when Machiavelli talks about how a prince can actually use deception to gain and maintain power. It's kind of like a spy thriller.
Oh, yeah, like the story about how Cesare Borgia tricked those Orsini guys.
Exactly. That was a classic move. Remind me how that went down.
Okay, so Cesare Borgia wanted to take out some of his rivals.
Okay.
These powerful nobles from the Orsini family.
Okay.
He knew they were plotting against him.
All right.
But he didn't want to just go in with guns blazing.
Yeah, that's usually not the best way to make friends and influence people.
Right. So Borgia played it smart.
Okay.
He pretended to make peace with them, invited them to a meeting, showered them with gifts.
So he was playing the long game.
Playing the long game.
Lulling them into a false sense of security.
Exactly. And the Orsini, well, they fell for it. They thought everything was cool, but then boom, Borgia's men swooped in and captured them.
That is cold.
It is.
It's like a scene straight out of a movie.
It is. And Machiavelli presents this whole story as an example of how a prince can use deception to eliminate enemies and consolidate power.
Wow. Machiavelli really doesn't pull any punches, does he?
No, he doesn't.
He's like, yeah, sometimes you got to be sneaky to survive in this game.
Yeah, he definitely doesn't shy away from the harsh realities of power.
Yeah.
And he even goes so far as to say that a prince needs to be willing to break promises.
Right. We talked about that earlier.
We did.
It's all about being practical and getting results, not about sticking to some abstract moral code.
Exactly. Machiavelli was very much a the ends justify the means kind of guy.
But it makes you wonder, though.
Yeah.
How far can you really take that idea before it just becomes Well, tyranny.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's the question that people have been debating ever since The Prince was published.
Because if it's really okay for a ruler to lie, cheat, and do whatever it takes to stay in power,
right?
Then where do you draw the line?
Where's the line?
What's to stop them from becoming a dictator?
That's the danger, right?
Yeah.
If power is the only thing that matters, then it's easy for leaders to justify all sorts of bad behavior.
And it's not just about individual rulers, right?
No, it's not.
Machiavelli's ideas could be applied to
everything.
Entire states.
Organizations.
Even to everyday life.
You're absolutely right. We see this all the time, don't we?
We do.
People justifying bad behavior in the name of some greater good.
So if Machiavelli's ideas are potentially so dangerous, why are we even talking about this book?
That's a really good question, and I think there are a few reasons why The Prince is still so important, even if we don't agree with everything Machiavelli says.
Okay, I'm listening. Convince me.
Okay, first of all, it's a brilliantly written and argued piece of political philosophy.
Okay.
Even if you disagree with his conclusions, you have to admire the clarity and forcefulness of his arguments.
He doesn't mess around. He gets straight to the point.
He does. And secondly, The Prince forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about power.
Uncomfortable truth. Okay.
It challenges us to think about how power is actually gained and maintained.
Right, yeah.
Not just how we wish it would work.
So it's like a reality check.
A reality check.
A reminder that the world doesn't always operate according to our ideals.
Exactly. And thirdly, I think Machiavelli's work is valuable because it gives us a framework for understanding how power dynamics play out in different situations.
Right.
Even if we don't want to be like Cesare Borgia, it's helpful to be able to recognize those kinds of tactics when we see them being used.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
It's like learning how to play chess.
Yeah.
You might not want to be a ruthless chess master, but it's still helpful to understand the game.
For sure.
So you can avoid being checkmated.
Exactly. And I think that's especially important for young people who are just starting to engage with the world of politics and leadership.
Yeah.
It's important to be aware of the different ways that power can be used, both for good and for bad.
Totally. We need to be able to think critically about these issues and make our own informed decisions about what kind of leaders we want to support and what kind of world we want to live in.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So to circle back to your question, was Machiavelli a cynic?
Well, I don't think there's a simple yes or no answer.
Okay. It sounds like he was definitely a realist.
A realist.
He saw the world as it was not as he wished it would be.
Right.
And he wasn't afraid to write about it.
That's right. And I think that's why The Prince is still relevant today.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that power is a double-edged sword.
A double-edged sword.
It can be used for good or for evil.
And it's up to us to decide how we want to use it.
That's the challenge. And it's a challenge that Machiavelli's work helps us to understand and hopefully meet for Larfone. Now, one point Machiavelli really hammers home is that rulers should never rely on mercenaries for their armies.
Oh, yeah. Mercenaries were a big no-no in Machiavelli's book.
Big no-no.
He even pulls examples from ancient history to prove his point. Like the Carthaginians, who relied so heavily on mercenary troops, and well, look what happened to them.
They were almost completely wiped out. Not just once, but twice.
Twice.
Both times in major wars with Rome. They were totally at the mercy of these hired soldiers who weren't truly loyal to anyone but themselves.
So even if you win a battle with mercenaries, you're still in a really risky situation.
Exactly. They could turn on you in a heartbeat. Remember, they're not fighting for patriotic ideals or love of their country. They're motivated by cold, hard cash.
Speaking of cash, mercenaries are expensive.
You know it.
Right.
They're always looking for the next payday.
Yeah.
And they're not above switching sides if someone offers them a better deal.
Right. Machiavelli gives this really interesting example of a mercenary captain named Paolo Vitelli, who was hired by the Florentines.
Oh, yeah, Paolo Vitelli. He was a wild card.
Machiavelli says that if Vitelli had actually been successful in capturing the city of Pisa, which he was trying to do for Florence, the Florentines would have been completely at his mercy.
Completely at his mercy.
He could have turned his army around and marched right on Florence itself.
Exactly. Machiavelli says the Florentines were lucky. Vitelli didn't capture Pisa. Yeah.
Otherwise, they might have become puppets of their own hired gun.
And that wasn't the only time the Florentines got burned by mercenaries. Remember when they hired those 10,000 French men-at-arms to help them besiege Pisa?
Oh, man, that backfired spectacularly. It actually put them in more danger than they were in before they hired those French mercenaries?
So Machiavelli is basically saying that relying on mercenaries is like playing with fire.
It's a recipe for disaster.
He's also got some interesting thoughts about auxiliaries.
Auxiliaries.
Those troops you borrow from an ally.
Yeah, they're not as bad as mercenaries.
Okay.
But they're still not ideal.
He uses the example of Pope Julius II.
Pope Julius.
Who hired Spanish troops as auxiliaries.
Yeah.
And it almost cost him everything.
I remember that story.
Yeah, it's a good one.
Julius was trying to conquer the city of Ferrara, and his own mercenary troops were doing a terrible job.
Totally useless, right?
Right. So Julius decided to call in some heavy hitters.
Okay.
He asked the King of Spain to send him some Spanish troops. Wow, asking a foreign king to send an army into Italy.
Yeah.
That's a bold move.
It was. But Julius was desperate to win this war. He was willing to take a risk.
But it didn't exactly go as planned, right?
Not at first. Those Spanish troops were defeated in a major battle at Ravenna.
Okay.
Which put Julius in a really tight spot.
Yeah, he had alienated his Italian allies.
He had.
By bringing in the Spanish.
And
now the Spanish had lost.
He
was caught between a rock and a hard place.
Exactly. But luckily for Julius, the Swiss intervened.
Wait, the Swiss?
The Swiss?
Weren't they neutral?
They had a reputation for being amazing warriors.
Okay.
And they were often hired as mercenaries.
Okay, so they swooped in to save the day.
They did.
Talk about a plot twist.
The Swiss attacked the French, who were allied with the Spanish,
okay,
and drove them right out of Italy. Definitely not what anyone expected.
Right.
But it worked out in Julius's favor.
And he was super lucky.
So
the lesson here is,
yeah,
be careful who you trust.
Be careful who you trust.
Especially when it comes to foreign armies.
Exactly. Machiavelli uses this example to show how dangerous it can be to rely on auxiliaries.
Okay.
Even with a strong alliance, you're still putting your fate in the hands of someone else's army.
Right.
You never know what might happen.
I think Machiavelli's point is, if you really want to hold on to power, you need an army that's loyal to you and you alone.
Right, an army made up of your own people, fighting for their own country.
Which brings us back to his idea of a national army.
The national army.
He was really convinced this was the only truly reliable way to defend a state.
And he had some strong arguments to back up that belief.
Yeah, he even uses a story from the Bible.
He does.
The story of David and Goliath.
Oh, yeah, I remember this one.
King Saul offered David his own armor to wear when he went to fight Goliath.
Uh-huh.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
But David refused.
He refused.
It was too heavy and awkward. And he ended up defeating Goliath, using only his slingshot and his faith in God.
His slingshot.
Machiavelli's point is that relying on someone else's tools or methods can actually be a disadvantage.
It's like trying to fight in someone else's shoes.
Exactly.
It just doesn't work.
That's how he felt about national armies.
Yeah.
He believed a state would be stronger and more secure if it relied on its own citizens for defense.
Yeah.
Not foreigners or mercenaries.
Because those citizens would be fighting for their own homes, their families, and their country.
Right.
It's a powerful motivator.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
That kind of personal stake would make you a pretty dedicated soldier.
It did. They were some of the toughest warriors in the ancient world.
Exactly.
And their dedication and discipline are a big part of why Rome expanded so quickly. They had an army that was ready to fight to the death for their city.
But the Romans didn't just rely on their army for expansion, right?
No, they didn't.
They also used some pretty smart political strategies.
Yeah. Machiavelli was really impressed by how the Romans built their empire.
So how'd they do it?
How'd they do it?
Well, they were masters of forming alliances.
But
they were also very strategic.
Strategic.
About who they allied with. And how they managed those alliances.
So they weren't just teaming up with anyone. They had standards.
They did.
Yeah.
And they were very careful to ensure that they didn't become too dependent on any one ally.
Why is that?
They didn't want to be beholden to anyone.
Yeah.
They always wanted to be in control.
That's clever.
Yeah.
It's like keeping your friends close, but your enemies closer.
Exactly. The Romans excelled at that.
I did.
They were always playing different factions against each other so they could maintain their own independence and power.
Wow. Talk about playing the long game.
Yeah.
Do you have an example of how they did this?
Machiavelli talks about how the Romans handled their relationships with the Achaeans and the Aetolians.
Oh, okay.
Two powerful Greek states.
I'm all ears.
So the Romans were fighting a series of wars in Greece, and they decided to ally with both the Achaeans and the Aetolians to help them conquer other parts of Greece.
Sounds like a win-win situation at first glance.
Yeah.
The Romans get more territory and their allies presumably get something out of it too?
Maybe at first. But Machiavelli points out that the Romans were very clever about making sure that neither the Achaeans nor the Aetolians got too powerful.
Ah, so they were playing them a little bit. Using them to achieve Roman goals, but also preventing them from becoming a threat to Roman power.
Exactly. It was all part of a bigger strategy for maintaining Roman dominance in Greece.
That's a really interesting example.
Yeah.
It shows even when working with allies,
right?
You need to be strategic and protect your own interests.
Yeah.
You can be friendly, but you also have to be smart.
Exactly. And it's not just about alliances, right?
Yeah.
Machiavelli also stresses the importance of military preparedness.
Military preparedness?
Even during peacetime.
Right.
He thought a prince should always be thinking about war. And making sure his army was ready for anything.
That sounds kind of stressful. Always preparing for the worst-case scenario.
It might sound that way. But Machiavelli argues that it's the best way to avoid being caught off guard. He compares it to a physician constantly on the lookout for signs of illness.
So they can catch a disease early on.
Right.
And treat it before it becomes a major problem.
Preventative medicine for politics.
Preventative medicine for politics.
Yeah, I like it.
Machiavelli believed that the same idea applied to politics.
Yeah.
A wise prince is always on guard, watching for threats to his power.
Right.
And dealing with those threats before they become crises.
So I guess it's like staying healthy. You're taking steps to keep yourself in good shape and avoid getting sick in the first place.
Right.
But instead of vitamins and exercise, it's political strategy and military preparedness.
Right. And one of the best ways to do that is to have a strong, well-trained army.
A strong army.
Machiavelli goes so far as to say that a prince should spend more time thinking about military matters than anything else.
Wow, that's dedication.
He was totally serious about this. Yeah.
He believed that military strength was the foundation of any state's power.
Right.
And that neglecting the military was basically asking for trouble.
And he had plenty of historical examples to back him up. Think about all the states that were conquered because they weren't prepared for war.
He even uses an example from his own time, right?
He does.
The French king, Louis XII.
Oh, yeah, Louis XII.
He made a bunch of blunders in Italy.
He did.
That ultimately cost him control of a territory he had conquered.
Lombardy.
Machiavelli basically says that Louis XII was a terrible strategist.
He broke all the rules. He didn't move to Lombardy to solidify his control. He didn't send colonists.
He didn't eliminate his rivals quickly enough.
And he made the huge mistake of letting the church, a major power in Italy back then, become too strong.
Right. Machiavelli says that was one of Louis XII's biggest blunders.
Yeah.
He actually helped Pope Alexander VI conquer the region of Romagna.
Right.
Which gave the church more land and resources and made the Pope a much stronger rival.
It's like he accidentally created his own worst enemy.
Exactly. Machiavelli basically says Louis XII was playing checkers while the Pope was playing chess.
Ouch.
I guess the lesson here is be careful who you strengthen.
Be careful who you strengthen.
They might use that strength against you.
That's a good takeaway. Machiavelli really understood how these power dynamics worked and how even the most powerful rulers can make mistakes that cost them everything.
It's like a constant game of strategy and maneuvering.
Yeah.
You always have to be thinking several steps ahead.
And you can't afford to be naive or sentimental about it. The world of power is a tough place.
Machiavelli wasn't afraid to show how that world works, warts and all.
Warts and all.
Okay, so we've talked about Machiavelli's advice for rulers.
We have.
His emphasis on military strength.
Yeah.
And his insights into power dynamics. But before we wrap up, there's one more thing I want to touch on.
Okay.
His views on human nature.
Oh, yeah. Machiavelli had some pretty interesting thoughts about that, didn't he?
He did. He was pretty convinced that human beings are inherently selfish, ambitious, and fickle.
That's not exactly the most optimistic view of humanity.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
But Machiavelli argued that it was a realistic view based on his observations of how people actually behave.
He believed that this inherent selfishness was a major factor in how people acted in politics.
Absolutely. He believed people were always looking out for their own interests, even if it meant betraying others or breaking their promises.
So for Machiavelli, there was no such thing as true loyalty or altruism in politics. It was all about power and self-interest.
And that's why he believed a prince couldn't afford to be naive about human nature.
Because if you assume people will act rationally and morally, you're setting yourself up for disappointment.
And potentially for disaster.
Exactly.
It's interesting to consider his views on human nature in the context of his other arguments.
What do you mean?
Well, if you believe that people are naturally selfish and ambitious, that it makes sense that you would advocate for a ruler who is strong, ruthless, and maybe even a little bit deceptive.
I see what you're saying. If you think everyone's out to get you,
you're going to strike first and ask questions later.
That kind of thinking can create a really cutthroat and cynical political environment.
Yes.
Where everyone is suspicious and nobody can be trusted.
It's a pretty bleak picture, isn't it?
It is, but it's also a view that has resonated with a lot of people over the centuries. Why do you think that is? Why are Machiavelli's ideas still relevant, even if we don't like what he has to say?
I think there are a few reasons.
Okay.
First, Machiavelli was a brilliant writer. He knew how to express his ideas clearly and forcefully.
Yeah.
And he wasn't afraid to challenge conventional wisdom.
He didn't sugarcoat anything.
Nope. He was blunt and honest, even if it made people uncomfortable.
Right.
And that's refreshing, even if you disagree with him.
I think another reason his ideas are still relevant is that they offer a kind of blueprint for understanding how power works in the real world.
It might not be pretty, but it's often true. We might not like to admit it, but people are still motivated by self-interest. Leaders still make shady deals. Countries still go to war for strategic reasons.
It's the reality of the world we live in.
Yeah.
And Machiavelli helps us see that reality, even if we don't always like it.
He was way ahead of his time.
He was.
His insights into power and human nature are still relevant today.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, before we move on to looking at some modern examples of Machiavelli's principles in action, let's revisit something you mentioned earlier about how his work has been interpreted in so many different ways.
Right. It's fascinating how people see different things in the Prince, depending on their own perspectives.
It's like there are two Machiavellis. The cynical pragmatist who believes the ends justify the means, and the more nuanced thinker who is simply trying to offer a realistic, albeit maybe pessimistic take on how power actually worked back then.
It's so important to read the Prince carefully. And critically evaluate his arguments.
Because depending on your interpretation, you could reach very different conclusions about how leaders should act and how we should organize society.
You could end up justifying all sorts of terrible behavior in the name of realpolitik, or you could use Machiavelli's insights to become a more effective and ethical leader.
It all comes down to how you apply what you learn. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground today. Machiavelli can be a pretty tough read. Before we wrap up part 2, let's go over some key takeaways for our listeners to ponder.
Sounds good. Let's recap what we've learned so far.
All right, number 1, Machiavelli believed that power was the most important thing in politics. He wasn't really interested in abstract ideals or moral principles. He was all about understanding how rulers could gain and maintain power in the messy real world.
Number 2, he thought a prince had to be willing to do whatever it takes to stay in power.
Whatever it takes.
Even if it meant breaking promises or being a little deceptive.
The ends justify the means,
Right.
At least that's how he saw it.
Number 3, never rely on mercenaries.
Never rely on mercenaries.
He was adamant about that.
According to Machiavelli, a national army made up of your own citizens is the only way to go if you want to truly defend your state.
And finally, Machiavelli believed that a prince had to always be vigilant. Even during times of peace. You got to keep an eye out for potential threats and be ready for anything.
Always be prepared. It's like the Boy Scout motto, but for Renaissance rulers.
So there you have it, folks. Those are some of the major takeaways from the Prince heavy stuff, right?
Definitely gives you something to think about.
Now, in the next part of our deep dive, we're going to see how these ideas from the 1500s actually play out in the modern world. We'll be looking for examples of Machiavellian thinking in everything from international relations to business and even everyday life.
So buckle up, everyone. It's going to be a wild ride.
Okay, so we spent the last 2 parts of this deep dive really kind of trying to get our heads around Machiavelli's ideas in The Prince.
Yeah.
We've talked fear, fortune, armies.
And
even a little bit about what Machiavelli thought about human nature.
Human nature.
Which wasn't exactly sunshine and rainbows.
Definitely not a love everyone, trust your feelings kind of guy.
But now it's time to bring things back to the 21st century.
Back to today.
We're going to see if we can find some real-world examples of Machiavelli's ideas in action.
Yeah, let's go hunting.
Ready to go hunting for some Machiavellian thinking.
Let's do it.
Okay, first things first. Remember how Machiavelli was writing during a time of crazy upheaval in Italy?
Oh, Oh, yeah.
Was like a political free-for-all.
Political free-for-all.
With all these city-states battling it out for power.
It was a chaotic and dangerous time.
Right.
It's no wonder he was so focused on how to survive.
Survive.
And thrive in that kind of environment.
So his book was basically born out of the realities of his world. It's like a survival guide for rulers.
Yeah.
In a dog-eat-dog world.
That's a great way to put it. And one of the most famous examples of a ruler who seemed to embody Machiavelli's principles was, you guessed it, Cesare Borgia.
Yep, the OG Machiavellian. The guy who was so good at the power game.
That
he inspired one of the most iconic fictional villains of all time.
Seriously, it's like Machiavelli looked at Borgia and said, yep, that's my guy right there. Living proof that my ideas work.
He was ruthless, cunning, and ambitious.
Ambitious.
The whole package.
And the craziest thing is Machiavelli actually met Cesare Borgia. He even served as a diplomat for the Florentine government during some of Borgia's military campaigns.
Talk about a front row seat to history.
Right.
He was basically watching a Machiavellian masterclass in action.
He was, and he was clearly impressed. Remember how in Prince Machiavelli praises Borgia for his ruthlessness, his cunning, and his willingness to use whatever tactics were necessary to get what he wanted?
Yeah, not exactly the be kind rewind approach to leadership.
Yeah.
But in the cutthroat world of 16th century Italy, maybe that's what it took to survive.
Right. It was a different time for sure.
Yeah.
And even though Borgia's time at the top was relatively short, he showed just how much power someone could grab if they were willing to follow Machiavelli's playbook. It's a bit scary when you think about it.
Yeah, kind of makes you glad you're not living in Renaissance Italy.
Yeah.
But okay, so Borgia is a great example of Machiavelli's ideas in action back in the 1500s.
Yeah.
But what about today? Are there any modern leaders or situations where we can see those same principles at play?
You bet. Machiavelli's work is still studied by politicians, diplomats, military leaders, and business executives all over the world.
Seriously?
Seriously.
A book written over 500 years ago is still relevant today.
Totally. His insights about power strategy, and let's face it, the sometimes not so nice side of human nature.
Human nature.
Are as relevant as ever.
So let's get specific.
Okay.
Where exactly are we seeing Machiavelli's fingerprints in the 21st century?
Well, one area where his ideas are super relevant is international relations.
International relations.
Remember, countries are constantly maneuvering for position on the world stage.
Right.
It's like a giant game of risk, but with real-world consequences.
And sometimes those consequences are pretty serious.
They are. And the countries use all sorts of Machiavellian tactics to get what they want. They form alliances, they spy on each other, they spread propaganda.
Right.
It's a high-stakes game of power and influence.
Yeah.
Just like in Machiavelli's day.
It's like a never-ending episode of House of Cards, but with a lot more at stake than just political careers.
That's a great comparison. And just like in House of Cards, sometimes the players have to make tough choices.
Yeah.
They might have to do things that are unpopular.
Right.
That might even seem morally questionable.
So Machiavelli would be right at home in the world of modern diplomacy.
He'd fit right in.
Okay.
He understood that sometimes leaders have to play hardball to get things done, even if it means bending the rules a bit.
And to be fair, not everyone believes that's the way things should be.
Right.
There are plenty of people who think countries should cooperate more and focus on solving global problems together.
Absolutely. Cooperation and diplomacy are essential, but it's important to be realistic. Countries are always going to be looking out for their own interests, even when they're working together.
Yeah.
And sometimes that self-interest can lead to conflict.
Yeah.
It's a complicated world out there.
It is. So it's kind of like Machiavelli's is giving us a secret decoder ring for understanding how international relations really work.
I like that analogy. He's helping us to see through the smoke and mirrors and understand the power dynamics at play.
Okay, so Machiavelli in international relations.
Check.
But I have a feeling his ideas show up in other areas of life too, right?
You bet. One area where Machiavelli's ideas are surprisingly relevant is the world of business.
Business? Really?
Business.
I guess I can see how his ideas about strategy and competition would apply to like military campaigns or political maneuvering. But I never really thought about it in terms of the business world.
Think about it. Businesses are constantly battling it out. For customers' resources, market share, and talent. They need to be strategic about how they position themselves. how they market their products, and how they deal with their rivals.
So it's kind of like a war.
It is kind of like a war.
But instead of fighting with armies and weapons, they're fighting with marketing campaigns and product launches.
Exactly. And just like in war, there are winners and losers.
Winners and losers.
Companies that aren't strategic, that don't adapt to changing market conditions, or that don't understand their competition, well, they're probably not going to last very long.
It's survival of the fittest, just like in the jungle.
Right. And sometimes companies have to make tough choices to stay ahead.
Right.
They might have to lay off workers, close factories, or merge with other companies. These decisions can be difficult and unpopular, but sometimes they're necessary for a business to survive.
It sounds like Machiavelli would have been a great CEO.
He probably would have.
Always thinking a few steps ahead, always willing to make the hard choices.
He definitely understood the importance of being strategic, decisive, and adaptable.
Decisive.
In a competitive environment.
Okay, so we've seen how Machiavelli's ideas can be applied to international relations and the business world.
Yeah.
It's amazing how his work from the 1500s is still relevant today.
It really is. He was a true visionary thinker.
It was. Now, as we wrap up this deep dive into The Prince, what's the most important thing you want our listeners to take away from all of this?
I think the most important thing is that understanding Machiavelli's ideas can help you navigate the complexities of power, whether you're talking about politics, business, or even your own personal life.
It's like he's giving us a set of tools for understanding how the world really works.
Right.
Not just how we might wish it worked.
Exactly. And knowing how to use those tools can help you make better decisions and achieve your goals, whatever those goals might be.
So there you have it, folks. That's The Prince in a nutshell. Well, maybe a slightly larger nutshell than usual.
A slightly larger nutshell.
We covered a lot of ground.
We did.
But there's always more to learn and explore.
That's the beauty of political philosophy.
That's the beauty of it.
It's all about asking questions, challenging assumptions, and thinking deeply about how we want to live together. In this crazy, complicated world.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, we'll wrap up this first episode of Framing Minds.
This first episode.
We hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
We'll be back next time.
Back next time.
With another deep dive into a book.
Another deep dive.
That has shaped how we think about politics, power, and what it means to be human.
Until then, stay curious. Keep those minds questioning.
Yeah.
And never be afraid to challenge the status quo.
See you next time.